They laughed again, even Fergus, who probably, by now, was unaware what he was talking about. Flan wants to stamp his mark on his new territory, Finola mused, passing Osrith a wooden tankard with some sort of distillation in it, some of it probably water. That northern coast is rich in stone and fishing, and the Norse have not spread that far. Yet, Osrith contributed, he would press Christianity on the kingdom, as he has done here. Churches, crosses. And another thought broke through her exhaustion, reminding her that 2 moons worth of days would have passed. Beatha had promised to meet her. Doira's Christian, protested Tadgev, his homeland. Unlike the heathen land you come from. Osrith nodded. Yes, it is that, now the Danes control it, she sighed. And, that'll be the once great kingdom of Northumbria, now returned to Thor and Woden, having been lifted from its paganism by Cuthbert and Comsil. Ha! Declared Tadg, mostly for Finolai's benefit. My handwed bean comes from the land made Christian by Comsil of Doir, you know. He made to punch Finolai on the arm, but missed, falling face first onto the linen ground sheet. The land that does not believe in the Psyche, because you can't believe in something you know is real, Finolai antagonized. That's like believing in my sword. Or my fist, Tadg mumbled back, as he sat back up. Or my ass. Finolai laughed, then they were all laughing heartily, something they hadn't done since before Findlaith had died. Then, Fergus collapsed onto his woolen blanket, dark red hair haloed above his head as he began snoring and farting, to the rest of their amusement. Then, Osrith she had closed her eyes, knowing that they were the 4 of them again. Even Domhnall had hinted at his approval of her skill in the fighting circle. It was still dark. Osrith opened her eyes, which made little difference. 3 lumps to one side of her indicated that her 3 warrior compatriots were in the land of the Psyche. And then came another crunch, over the broken twigs fallen from the ash trees surrounding their area of the banqueting hall. Osrith opened her eyes wider, pushing herself up with difficulty on Finolai's fur mantle. Her back was stiff. She couldn't have raised her arm to fight with the Frankish sword even if she had it. What happened next happened so suddenly, Osrith could barely believe it. Hands, enough to abduct one of the sleeping lumps of a warrior without a murmur of protest, came in through the front of the tent. Osrith scrambled to her feet, slowly and with difficulty as muffled shouts ebbed away on the breeze. It was Finolai. He regularly slept by the entrance as it was usually the last place available when he returned most nights. The last of them. Scrambling to her feet she tripped over the lump that was Fergus, bowling out of the tent. Then scrambling to her feet, Osrith looked about her, adrenaline hiding pain as her back beat a dull thud of injury. Where had they gone? Morning had not yet broken, but there was enough proto-dawn for her to distinguish 2 figures carrying something between them. She tore towards them, as someone else joined the 2. But it was not Finolai. The high-pitched scream told Osrith that it was a woman. Pushing harder, the stiffness her body making running worse, she headed after them, down past the southern UNA tilde copyright hill camp, past the middens and onto the path that took her down to the beach where she had met the heathens. Stumbling over Ghorse, Osrith tumbled down the narrow path and catching her head against a tussock of grass. She shook herself, looking out towards the beach, and froze. Her ship, oars flat in the water, floated still in the glass-like sea, its sails betraying its strait. Osrith gasped at the air as she hurried herself upright to work out what was going on. A man, vast, broad, hands either side of his protruding stomach, crouched down and investigated the bundle, who swiped and scraped out with her fingers. The captors of this woman stood either side of her as she turned and, predictably, made to run. Osrith crouched lower, as the beginnings of dawn shone light on the slave trader, for that's what he was, his ship crewed by muscle and sinew, eyes belonging to that muscle peering over the taffrail of the vessel. Osrith skirted around another gorse, sand filling her shoes as the woman's captors negotiated with the man. There was clearly a discrepancy over price. The slaver was not happy with the money the woman's captors thought she was worth, and he pulled her to him, hands squeezing breasts, squeezing buttocks, thighs. A slow grin formed on his face. But it was clear the woman wasn't going to be sold as a slave easily. Struggling out of the man's reach, she charged at one of her captors, bending low. The other man caught her around the neck, however, and caught up her arms behind her back. A price was clearly negotiated quickly after this, and the man bundled the woman into the little boat he had clearly come to shore in from the slaver. Another man, perhaps a second in command, stood, 1 foot on the bow of the ship as if anticipating the slave captain's return. The two men, deal done, were now heading up towards the dunes. Osrith tucked in as much as she could, trying to look up to see if she knew the men, but it still was not bright enough for her to make out their features. They were young, though, and trod the dune grass easily. Osrith got to her feet. The slaver was clearly having difficulty with the woman, who was struggling in his arms, and she ran as fast as she could towards the little boat. The slaver slapped her in the face, but the woman remained defiant. She then opened her mouth, as if talking. Osrith raced on, stumbling though the sand was flat from the newly retreating tide, and then drew to a stop. The woman's voice could be heard on the wind. Ethn. The woman was shouting with all her might. Hammy Ethn, I am the Queen of Tara. I am wed to. Another smack in the face lulled the woman, Ethn, as the little boat reached its parent. And then another thought struck Osrith. She knew the name. Donchada had said that name, Ethn, on the night after Finlaith had been buried. Ignoring the throbbing agony across her shoulders, Osrith drove herself on, running into the waves. From the prow, the other slaver called to his master, and pointed as Osrith drove further and further on. But it was all for naught. The woman Ethn was bunked over the taffrail, and the little rowing boat was hauled up and into the ship. A wave of the hand from the slaver who had taken the girl, and a shout of instruction down to the slaves caused the oars to rise, and then strike the water, pushing away at it, one side doing more work than the other at first, in order to turn the boat and head it out to sea. Osrith stood, thigh-deep, in the brine as the morning sun shone down on the slave ship and its odious cargo. She had seen slavers before. They were common on the horizon and the far distance over the seascape. Osrith had asked Father Buku about them, and he had not minced his words. Men should not take other men for property, came his reply. Yet, her Unvlaufric bought slaves from time to time to work in the kitchens. Where would that woman, Ethn, end up? She was feisty, but hunger would wear her out in the end. Was she really Queen of Dara? She must have made that up as a desperate attempt to be freed. And yet, mused Osrith, the identical name to hers had been spoken by Don Chado at Ermadka. Would she make up a lie so obvious, considering all had seen Muir marry Flancina 2 days before? As she got to the stubby beach grass, finding the way easily with her feet, Osrith suddenly pulled up sharply. If the bundle those two men had been carrying was that woman Ethn, what had happened to Finolai? She knew he had gone. The waxed linen ground sheet where he had lain, asleep, had still been warm. Osrith hurried back towards the camp, looking up towards the ridge over which Domnall's warrior's tent was hung. What had happened to Finolai? It did not take Osrith long to find out. As her legs wearied climbing past the midden heaps, a groan came from the dense forest of trees that lay surrounding the bottom sectoon of the banqueting hall field. Further investigation led Osrith to the outline of a cage, strung over a vast branch of a tree. The noise was coming from inside the cage, a fuffing noise, as if whatever was in there was trying to catch its breath. It was Finolai. Sun from the east shone onto his face. Have loomed up when he heard Osrith's crunchy footsteps. Go away, hissed Finolai, when she realized who it was. No. What are you doing in there? Praying. Or I might as well be. Then Finolai's dry sense of humor failed him and he hung his head. I am to be sold. Sold? Slavery. Finolai sighed. Osrith trod closer to the cage. It was likely. Unlike prisoners about to be executed, Finolai had not been touched, lest he lose his value. The slave ship's gone, Osrith asserted, sitting down next to Finolai and recounted her story, about following him, about Ethn, and being Queen of Tara. It's probably true, if that was her, Finolai said, sadly. Ethn was Domnall's sister, and she was, Up until Muir married Flancina, his wife, Osrith felt her mouth fall open. His wife, when he had married Muir, did she know about this? And what of Domhnall, and Don Shada? Don Shada was probably put in charge of it all. Finolai continued, his voice low. Malruanade and Engus are too young to have carried out such an intrigue. He sighed. Married 5 years and not one pregnancy, let alone a child. And, the line must continue. But Osrith broke off, considering the outrageous news. Domhnall's sister. It's likely he didn't know, probably why I chased after her. I couldn't run fast enough to save her. Then, Osrith looked at Finolai. Why are you here? I've been taken for selling to the slaves, too, the black-haired warrior replied, resignedly. But why? Osrith looked at her friend, demanding an answer. I am what he has paid for the support of the Gales here to regain the Pictish throne. He looked up at Osrith, putting his hands over hers. Domhnall said the political situation was precarious. Flancina is purifying Christianity, so that God will favor him and the Aryan can unite against the Norse, including those in Alba. But, Domhnall will be king. I cannot be the reason he is not. He knows it. Domhnall did this. Now, things were getting unbelievable. The look in their eyes, when she had chanced seen them looking at one another, was pure, was one of love. But Finolai shook his head and looked to the floor. I doubt he knows, and when he finds out it will be too late. But, Osrith felt amazed at this turn. For politics, these kings would sell their own family? Did I not say that to love a royal prince meant death? Then, they should take me, too, Osrith argued, for I have lain many times with Constantine when I swore to Domhnall I would stay chaste. Men, Finola clarified, but Osrith did not believe it. A royal princess was about to enter a life of poverty and abuse, for this king to further his ambition? No wonder Domhnall had been incandescent. We can dig the floor, Osrith suggested, warming to an idea of escape. She scraped the earth with her hands, which yielded few fragments of earth. It's baked solid. Yule could never burrow through in 1,000 years. Thointh Osrith swore, leaning back onto the cage, searching for an obvious solution. Come on, think, Finolai. But the warrior sank onto the floor. You're giving up. Osrith now turned her anger at his imprisonment and imminent fate back onto her friend. You are letting yourself be sold into slavery for Domhnall. I would die for him, Finolai sighed. But, that was not the answer Osrith would accept. She tried pushing and pulling at the willow, but it would not move. A heavy second ring held the cage onto the floor. A key was needed. But, thought Osrith, from where? Her answer came in the form of a heavy, thick-set guard, thumping his feet across the leaf litter. Finolai shook his head, willing her not to try anything. But, Osrith had already pulled herself up into the tree and watched the man wipe his hand across his nose, then the huge goblet of mucus into the meager food ration Finolai was about to receive. As the man undid the lock, Osrith observed that he had put key inside his jerkin. Good. There was a key. And it was there against his no doubt sweaty, clammy body. Osrith moved so she was directly in line above the man, and, when he was about to bend down to lock the cage, allowed gravity to pull her down onto him. The man had no time to struggle, or prowess at her riding on his back. Osrith had taken his head, fingers pushing his eyes into their eye sockets before lifting his hair up with the back of his head, slammed it off the hard-baked earth. Blood seeped out from under his head, and Finolai drew his breath in sharply. But Osrith was already fumbling in the man's leather jerkin for the key, which she found easily, and with it clicked the lock open. Come on, urged Osrith, as Finolai continued to stare at the man. You have to go, Finolai, she urged, trying to force the heavy man back under the cage. Just when Osrith thought he would never duck under the woven willow cage, Finolai stepped out, clearly upset about his future enslavement, and his love's political future. He would want you to live, Osrith added, guessing his thoughts. Finolai nodded, but then backed away as Osrith held out Soethebug, her last silver piece. I cannot take this, Finolai protested. I won it betting on cups, Osrith lied, pressing her much-needed silver coin against her fingers. Suddenly, Finolai closed his hand around the coin, taking it from Osrith. before herring off into the forest. Osrith watched him go, until he could see him no longer. 88,888,888. What say you, Osrith Lackland? It was the afternoon. Osrith knelt before the High King of all Ireland, closing her eyes. Maybe Flann Sinner had presided over other matters, in the few hours that he had been voted as such. Now, a full council of the UNA Copyright Hill had been convened, seated in a horseshoe arrangement just before the LUFA !Eel, the Stone of Destiny. Osrith had managed a few hours' sleep before Domhnall had fetched her himself from the warrior's tent, telling her that she was in disgrace and, by extension, so was he. The true king of Alba was seemingly unmoved at Finn Olai's absence, as Tadg and Fergus flanked her past breakfasts for warriors and servants, their delicious smells filling the air with gastronomic deliciousness. Osrith's stomach grumbled as the charge against her was levelled, that she attacked Domhnall MacDUNA Copyright Ill, having been brought from the competition ring by him the night before. Osrith had said nothing. Domhnall had spoken for her, standing by her side, Fergus and Tadg just behind him as Flann, next to Muir, listened to him in sombre silence. As they walked away from the camp and up towards the hill of Timir, Domhnall warned her to say nothing. But, before they set foot on the hill, Osrith turned to Domhnall and smiled. I will not, Lord, for fear of further shame to you. I am sorry for this. Osrith searched his face for some flicker of guilt, something that would tell her he knew nothing about Finn Olai, but she could discern nothing and had to content herself with trusting that her friend had got himself as far away from Tara, from Mike, from Irian as he possibly could. Now, with Flann's sons, Don Chada, Engus and Elruinade at his side, and Constantine by Muir's, Osrith had knelt low on the grass of that sacred hill, ready to beg forgiveness from the new king, under whose protection she depended. Yet, how could she, honestly in her heart, ask for it when at least one of the men before her had been complicit in sending into slavery one of their own, a royal princess, whose position as Flann Sinner's previous wife, and sister of Domhnall had not been enough to prevent her fate. And now, the High King had asked to hear from her. My lord, she nodded across to Domhnall, has been good enough to allow me to warrior by his side. Osrith began. I am, first and foremost, a warrior, and I saw an opportunity to replace my father's sword, which was taken from me. She raised her head, and looked at Domhnall. I deeply regret my actions to Prince Domhnall, King of Doia, of the Northern UNA Copyright Ill. She sighed. Before finishing, and whatever punishment you see fit, I shall bear it with my head held high, and the honor given to me by my lord Domhnall, rightful king of Alba, in the name of the true God Almighty. There was nothing else to say, Osrith thought, as she got up from her knees, keeping her head bowed low. She must trust that Domhnall would defend her, as his warrior, and try to forget that he may have been complicit in casting Finn Olai, also his warrior, aside. My lord king, Domhnall said, by her left. Indeed, it is right to bring to hear the actions of my warrior and proclaim a judgment. This Saxon girl was travelling to the holy island of Iona, on pilgrimage with her family when all were killed by a Norse attack. She saved the life of our cousin, Constantine, when he was a young child on the field of battle and has sought to do her duty by the house Aetildilpin ever since. Osrith felt herself crumble with humility at Domhnall's eloquence, his words condensing and distilling her finer attributes for the ears of a king of kings. Moreover, Domhnall continued, placing a hand on Osrith's shoulder, she warrior of exceptional skill that I have sought to use to my advantage, something she hadles delivered many times. By her own admission she did attack my cousin Domhnall. I can only assume, my lord king, he looked across to Flann, that in doing so, no doubt she was endeavouring to protect herself as I instructed her to. Protect? Asked Flann, as Osrith saw Muir shifting uncomfortably in the seat next to her new husband. She suspected what happened, Osrith guessed. She was about to be violated, Domhnall continued, baldly, and I thank you, cousin Don Chada, for your timely intervention in preventing this act." He nodded at Flan's firstborn, who sat still, silent, and nodded his head once, in acknowledgement. "This prevented shame being brought to my name." He looked across at Domnall, whose complexion, Osrith noticed, had paled to a milky white. "I am sure you too, cousin Domnall, were only seeking to prevent her dishonor." Domnall did not make any move, but sat still and silent. And now, the king called Osrith over to him again, beckoning with a thick finger, amusement in his eyes. Getting slowly to her feet, Osrith walked steadily towards the High King, then much closer, for the king kept beckoning until Osrith was within inches of his face. He appraised her body, and her hair. "Kaleen cannot be warriors," he said, quietly. "Yet you can better the warrior of my nephew to win a sword." "I am no Kaelen, I am English," Osrith replied. The sword was a good sword. The king beckoned her closer still, stale ale and meat on his breath as he spoke close to her ear. "You are no warrior without a sword," Flan continued, whispering only to her. "Your hair will grow again. During that time you must find a way to earn it back." Then, almost as an afterthought, added, "My nephew is as much of a bastard as his sister was a bitch." King Flan of Tara and High King of all Ireland then pushed her away, pointing to a spot 3 feet in front of him. Osrith looked at it, feeling the weight of Flan's words. Ethn, a bitch to equal her bastard of a brother. Did she really deserve slavery? She faltered on her feet as she realized that was where he wanted her to stand. Domnall strode over to it, standing next to Osrith. "Osrith Lackland, do you swear loyalty to the Ætildilpin line, throughout its generations for the remainder of your life?" Osrith turned, and looked at Domnall. Women did not swear allegiances, for women were not warriors who could trust a woman's word, especially as this one had a prior call on her honor to leave the Ætildilpin line as soon as possible, find her brother. Everyone waited. Osrith realized all eyes were on her. She had to make it true. Lowering her eyes, she fell to her knees, head lowered, eyes to the grass. "I promise loyalty," she declared, as clearly as she could, so no one could mistake what she said, "to the line of Ætildilpin, King of Alba, to Domnall." She looked up into Domnall's pale, narrow face, into his grey eyes, then across to Constantine, similar in feature to his cousin, and added, "Constantine Mact and all who come after." It was clearly popular. A cheer arose from the warriors behind the royalty. Tadg and Fergus knelt too, proclaiming their loyalty to Domnall. Osrith looked at their boots, a pang of sadness passing through her, for the pair that were missing, and sent a rare prayer for Finolai's safety to God. Then, "Rise, Osred Lackland," declared King Flan, who also rose. "King Domnall of Alba," he said, beckoning him over. "I leave punishment to you for the wrongdoing over your warrior." Osrith chanced to look across to Domnall, whose face was even paler than before, his features frozen, as if he dare not move them for fear of unleashing his anger. "I give this to you," Flan added, taking up the Flemish sword, Osrith's one which Don Chada had confiscated. Osrith realized for the first time that it had been, for the duration of the trial, at the king's feet. "You will keep it on behalf of your warrior, and only allow her to have it when she has proved her oath." And with that, Flan put out his arm for Muir, who got to her feet, giving Osrith an impassive look, before walking past Don Chada, past El Ruinade, his second son and the image of his father, past young Angus and, finally, Domnall, whose face was blacker now than thunder. The first judgment of the King of all Ireland was over. Osrith was still alive. 88,888,888. "I know what you did, and I thank you, Osrith Lackland." It was night, and Domnall of House Ætildilpin had, after ordering her to rest, summoned her to his tent. "You were very lucky this day," Domnall continued, as she stood before him, still aching from her wounds, still ungainly in limb. "Flan is known for his severity. If it had been anyone else, he would have, no doubt, had you publicly flogged, then run through." Osrith nodded, thinking back to the words the king had spoken in her ear. Despite women being frowned upon as warriors, He had encouraged her. Flansinner had approved of her abilities as a warrior and given her hope. "My punishment, Lord," Osrith prompted. "I am here so you may thrash me." Domhnall looked at Osrith, his cold, grey eyes appraising her. "Shall we say that the brutal fight you engaged in, to win your sword was punishment enough?" He held it up, withdrawing it, then, getting to his feet, spun it in his hand, feeling the weight. "I may keep this, it is a good sword," he continued, then flicked the corners of his lips into a smile. "Perhaps it will be the sword I use to run Giric through, and reclaim my throne." Osrith looked at the sword, dark texture on one side making it look as if it was sitting in shadow. "Let it be so, Lord," Osrith replied. "You said I can request a sword, so I request one." Domhnall shot her a look. "You may not have a sword, not yet. I will keep this, it is yours." Domhnall resheathed it into its fleece-lined scabbard. "But, you must realize, the situation with the southern Yuan Neils, especially Flansinner, with those in the north is precarious." You, throwing down her sword, he drew Osrith closer, placing a hand on both of her shoulders. "You fought and drew attention to yourself against Domhnall's man, and not good attention. Flan hates Domhnall, for Domhnall is undermining the king. He wants his father's throne. You have played into their game." The king of Alba sighed. "Osrith, your actions are not worthy of an English warrior." He pulled her closer, looking into her eyes. "Your actions today, yesterday, and always are worthy of a Gaelish prince." And then, Osrith found she had pressed her lips to Domhnall's, breathing heavily as she brought her hands to his face. His hands were at her waist, and he kissed her, heavily, hungrily. He was not like Constantine, who never kissed her. Domhnall felt strong under her arms, driving his lips against hers, and the shivery sensations she had felt with Constantine came across her skin, faster, and more intensely. A moment later, and Osrith had pulled at his breeches, reaching down, touching him with her hand. His cock was not yet stiff. Perhaps if she held it closely, and moved her hand up and down, as Domhnall had done to himself before he had tried rape her, then dash. Domhnall broke away, face beaded with perspiration, pulling her hand away. "It cannot be, Osrith," Domhnall protested. "And I do not want it, really," Osrith protested, as the exiled king of Alba trailed a hand between them. Then, silently, she screamed, "You could find Finoli again, you could continue your love." Osrith chanced to step forward. "I would just need to be a warrior, by your side." But Domhnall shook his head. "I am to marry Mary," he said, sorrowfully, turning his head from her. "These things are not for me. I do not want them as a man. I have to make Gaelish heirs, as must Constantine. But I must do them in order to be a king who will unite Alba under one ruler, and so, dear Osrith," he looked up to her, torment in his eyes, "I must be firm and strong." "Without Finoli?" she asked, then regretted it as soon as she had said it. Hurt filled Domhnall's eyes, and he narrowed his eyes towards her. And then, Osrith realized, they were filling with tears. "Without Finoli," he confirmed. "You may well see him again," Osrith replied, quietly. "He has been sold into slavery, shortly after Rethn. That is one reason Don Shada will rebel against his father some day." But Osrith's heart began to lift and she smiled joyfully at Domhnall. "What if I told you he hadn't?" Then, before Domhnall could ask her, she continued, "I let him go, I freed him." But, though Osrith thought that Domhnall would be pleased, instead, he took her by the shoulders, his face filling with anger. "You can't have. You mustn't have." But Osrith only smiled wider. "I did. I freed him. I gave him all the silver I had." And then, the king of Alba drew her to him, holding her to him and kissed her forehead. "You would indeed make a fine consort," Domhnall whispered, close to her ear. Then Osrith whispered back, "For I would rather be wed to a king so I could continue to be his warrior." He drew her back, and looked into her eyes. "That would never be possible. A king needs to further his line. If you required it of me." "You are good, Osrith, you have the heart of a Gael." Then, a thought occurred to Osrith, a dangerous thought. "What if I had something else?" Osrith babbled, desperately. You want to expand your kingdom once you reclaim it? He waited, looking into her face, said no words as Osrith continued. I know you want to expand your kingdom into Northumbria. Osrith's words tumbled over her tongue like spring water over rocks. When you overcome your usurpers, this is what you desire. It is. Well, and then she stopped, her hypothalamus finally getting through to her hippocampus. It would be so easy to tell him who she was, that she had a claim on Bibbenberg, so any husband of hers would have a claim too, and on land in Northumbria. She could access the fortress through entrances only she knew. Let his army in. But then, Utad, could she betray her brother? The light dimmed in her eyes. She would not tell. She was the daughter of an artisan whose family died on the battleground before Dunnottar on a Norse attack. You should rest, Osrith, for we have a long journey back to Doire. Domhnall stepped back from her, his mind filling with hope that she had given to him. And Alba, he added, to himself, for we will be there sooner than anyone believes, thanks to the High King. He watched the adolescent girl warrior cross the stubby grass over to the waiting Tadg and Fergus. But no Finolai. Because of her, and because of what you did for him, you have saved yourself, Edra of Bibbenberg. 88,888,888. Whitsun 880. As Father Baker left the church at Winchester that evening, our letter was pushed into his hand. Frowning in the candlelight, he strode out onto Winchester's High Street, the evening's sun's rays illuminating the yellowing sheet, looking over the letters once, and then once again. Good evening, Baker. Utad Ragnarsson's voice carried through the mellow air. He strode over to Priest, who looked up from the missive. Baker looked up, his face alight with happiness as he read the letter once more. Something pleases you? Utad prompted, glancing between the priest and the letter in his hands. Utad. Baker snapped his head up, looking at the warrior almost as if he were a stranger. Utad, he repeated, more softly. I went to see Alfred, as you suggested. Utad held his jaw, then shook his head. I'm heading north, father. I mean, Brida's gone with Ragnar. I feel Northumbria calling me.